Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel. It's going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to tee up our panelists with some questions. But basically what we're here to do is to talk about the global kind of open source collaboration that the UN is increasingly facilitating in the last couple years. And this has been exemplified most prominently with 2 editions of the OSPOs for Good conference and the upcoming UN Open Source Week, where there'll be another edition of the OSPOs for Good conference. So I'm going to kind of spare you the introduction, and I'll have some remarks of my own later. But I want to tee up Omar to talk a little bit more about what the UN is doing around open source. Omar, over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. My name is Omar Mohsine. I work for the UN Office of Information Communication Technology and the UN Office of Digital. Sorry, there's a lot of acronyms. That's what we do at the public administration. Anyways, I spare you the acronyms. So I work on the open source. We don't call ourselves the OSPO, but we're kind of the OSPO of the internal UN open source. And I'm here just to talk about sustainable development goals and why it matters, why open source matters. So again, some of you raise your hand if you know the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Ah, okay. Thank you, guys. I feel good. So those are 17 goals that the world came up together and then defined them together. And then these are about really helping everyone. It's about health and education and building sustainable future. It's about climate. It's about life on land, life underwater. 17 big goals that really would define humanity. But why it matters and why I'm here to talk to you about that, because when member states define the SDGs, they say that to get there, technology is the main mean of implementations. We cannot deliver health for everyone or food for everyone or gender equality without technology. And us now, more and more, we're realizing it's beyond technology, it's actually open source is the main mean for us to deliver on that. Why? Because of collaborations. These are very big topics, very big problems that we're trying to solve, and no one government, no one entity, no one administration will be able to deliver on these. And we can only get there together. And then when we talk about collaboration at the UN, like we think of committees, what actually you guys, what you build as open source community is the best example. Like you're the dream of any government, is that you have people working together from different parts of the world. They never met each other. So how can we now leverage that power that you guys have built, this collaboration that is incredible, and then bring it towards human problems? I know a lot of colleagues get angry at me, like open source community, you're fantastic, but a lot of tools that you build are really about, there's fantastic tools, but how can we at least move at 20-25% of the communities start building tools that are about people, about an SDG, taking an SDG problem and solving it, instead of pieces of infrastructure or instead of pieces of kernels. So this is what our goal, and to get there, this is what we would like to talk about. One small thing that we do is called OSPO for Good. It's a conference that we do in New York where we try to bring in everyone, government, public sector, private sector. This is a bit of our superpower at the UN, that the thing we know how to do is we have the trust, and that we are the convener. We talk to anyone. Everyone is our member state. So we try to use that power for the open source community, bring them together. So we had 2 editions of this OSPO for Good. Raise your hand if you attended OSPO for Good. Oh, wow. Thank you, guys. So it's we started in 23. It was an experimentation. We were like 70. And it was the discussion was so meaningful, and the connection that were built was so great that we decided to have it the next year and scale it up. And last year, I'm happy, Germany was our first sponsor, strong interest, and we're very happy we had the strong presence in the room from Germany, and then Kenya. But really, what was important about the conference is we didn't decide it us. It wasn't a we're the kings of conferences, but they're boring. Sorry. But here we wanted something that is actually from the open source community. So what we did is a program committee where we said, dear open source community, help us define it. So we had 3 committees with big names from the open source world that actually help us define it. And then in the room, we pick some really interesting topics that matters to everyone, like open source in government, open source in cities. There's this massive revolution happening within cities. Open source at the UN. We had some really interesting debate discussions, and as a result of it, many new initiatives started. And tomorrow, I just want to promote a panel that will take place here. It's the Chaos project that started because at OSPO for Good, where now there's work happening on SDG metrics. So this is just a small of the multiple things that were born from those 2 days of bringing people together. So now we're hard at work again with our partners from Germany and Zendis and Sovereign Tech Fund and OFE, designing the next one, the 25, where we want it to be even bigger. So please Google it. It's called UN Open Source Week. There's a page where you could register. We'd love to have all of you over there. This year, we're bringing together the digital public infrastructure track and the open source track. So it's going to be DPI and DPGs coming together, and we're planning for a lot more geographic representations. We want to bring a lot more countries and people in the room. We had a big representation from Africa, from Asia last year, and Latin America and Europe. Now we're putting a lot of focus to bring in really the whole five continents together. This is, in a nutshell, OSPO for Good and Open Source Week. Again, really for us here, the goal is what the problems we're trying to solve, nobody can do it on their own. We really is only by bringing everyone. And back to some of the question that came today, is there an EU open source? Is there an American open source? Is there an African open source? No, there's one open source, and it's global, and we want it to remain global. There's multiple uses. So here's that place where we define together as global, where we want to be heading as a community.
And if you want to learn a little bit more about that conference, all the videos are available on UN Web TV, and we also have a conference report. We had the chair of OFE, Sachiko Muto, one of the co-authors of the report, who's going to be here to talk about the report a little bit more in depth, but she couldn't make it, as many couldn't. But if you search for the conference report, OSPOs for Good 2024 conference report, you'll find it out there. So in the last conference, 2024, we talked a lot about the idea of harnessing the collective power and innovation of the global open source community to achieve the SDGs, but also what the UN can do for the global open source community. I wanted to focus today's discussion on two things. One, kind of the continued geopolitical challenges we face and their relationship to open source collaboration, and two, the question of how we get there. This is a piece of feedback that we got repeatedly last year is, this is all great and there's a lot being done, but what can we do and what comes next? So, I wanted to start off with Wolfgang. You are the FOSS ambassador and OSPO lead at Mercedes-Benz Tech Innovation, and your work has been acclaimed recently for its increasing support of open source and collaborative innovation as a positive example in industry. Many of the speakers and attendees at the conference differed in their perspectives, with some more positive and more negative on the possibilities for kind of uniting and driving collective action. Could you talk a little bit about your perspective from industry? What is the importance of championing principles around open source contribution and support, and what does that actually look like at Mercedes?
Okay, thank you. So what is the importance of open source for industry? It's, I think it can actually hardly be overstated. So, you know, if you develop software these days, it's just not possible to do without open source, or it doesn't make sense. And our CIO, Katrin Lehmann, she says, investing in open source is nowadays one of the smartest entrepreneurial decisions you can make as an industry. And so open source, we really want to champion open source. We want to drive it forward and become a very FOSS-savvy company. And we've started our journey in open source quite a few years ago. And you know, so when the United Nations came out with the open source principles just a few months ago, that for me really was heartwarming, because we have published something similar already back in 2020, the Mercedes-Benz FOSS Manifesto. And this is a set of rules and guidelines that outline the importance of open source for us as a company. And several big industry companies have followed suit and have adapted these principles to their a particular company, big names like Continental Automotive, they were the first ones to adopt it, and then Siemens and Porsche, SAP, the German railway company Deutsche Bahn, ETAS, and a few others. And so one of the open source, the UN open source principles are of course a bit different because they're geared towards the public sector. We're in the private sector. So the first one, for example, in the UN, it says open by default. So that's not something as an industry we can do for everything that we publish. Because there is software that we use as a competitive advantage, and so we're not going to open source that. But everything else, we want to open source as much as possible, and we even collaborate with other industry partners on that. There's, for example, in the automotive sector, there's the software-defined vehicle, for example, where we collaborate with other players, not just automotive, but also some of our competitors on things that, hey, this is not a competitive advantage. Why don't we work on it together? Across borders, across companies, and so forth. The second one, UN principle, is contribute back. And that's something that is deeply ingrained in our manifesto as well. We have principles that say, our engineers, please contribute back as much as you can, and the company will support you in this effort. So this is very much aligned with our ideas as well. All right, so bottom line, FOSS, open source, is like the air you breathe. Can't do without it anymore in software development. And that's all there is to it, almost.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing is, regardless of where you come from, whether it's industry, civil society, academia, or global collaboration, the perspective on building OSPO is relatively similar. There's certainly some shareable lessons. So next up, we have Adriana Groh, who is the CEO of the Sovereign Tech Agency. Adriana, thank you so much for joining us last minute, due to Sachiko not being able to join us. So you keynoted on the beginning of day 2 at the conference last year. And given your participation, you must have been reflecting a lot on kind of the German model for open source collaboration and its relationship with the rest of the world. Given all that's happened in the last 8 months, but also what you learned at the conference, are there some areas where you can see global open source collaboration being most strategic in the coming years?
Thank you. So I have the great honor of covering for Sachiko and feel the immense pressure on me right now. But yeah, we indeed had a keynote at the last OSPOs for Good together with Zendis already, which is, I think, exactly the right thing to do, because there's no one instrument or one strategy approach that's going to tackle all structural challenges and all the goals we want to achieve with open source. So I believe that we need to identify where to get active and how we should do it, what's the best strategy, and then build instruments that tackle each challenge and then have them working together. I think sometimes we have the urge to have this one big thing and this is going to fix all our problems and it's going to bring very good stuff, but it's not working like that. And in Germany, what we did, not just in the past 8 or 9 months, but since, let's say, 2 years or even more, is to really look at the opportunities in the open source ecosystem and then come up with the Sovereign Tech Fund, now the agency, and Zendis to design public, quasi-public institutions that use public money in the public interest to invest in open source in very different ways, but very complementary. And that's why it was so great to present that model as well at the UN, because Germany is ahead in this. I know it's a surprise, but there are lots of countries reaching out to Zendis and to the Sovereign Tech Agency, and they're like, this is super interesting, and this is, I think, a great strategy, and maybe we can do that too, or we can do it together, which is even better. So I think this whole idea of working together, what Omar said, it's not just what we want to achieve, SDGs or whatever, it's also like how we achieve it. And the principles of open source are, I think, exactly what we need. And the whole idea of not develop for, but develop with, and doing it in a collaborative, open, sustainable, decentralized way is just as important as setting the goals, what we want to achieve. And if you want to work in that way to achieve what you want to achieve, you have to use open source and not just any technology. So I think, have I missed a part of your question?
What are some of the strategic opportunities you see going
Well,
forward?
that is the most important one. The strategic opportunity now in this very situation is not to reinvent the wheel all the time, but look at the blueprints, I'd like to say, that we developed. Like Zendes and the Sovereign Tech Agency are both pretty young, but we've tested a few things. There are others out there doing just as good work. And then, just like Wolfgang also said, just see what others do, adapt, maybe improve, and go ahead, and that's how you scale. And understanding open source here as the strategy that you want to use to achieve your goals is, I think, what more and more people are understanding. There was also a hearing in the German Parliament end of last year, again with Zendes and us, where I was making exactly that point, because I'm not a technologist by training, but I understand that in order to achieve goals that we have as a society, open source is the best strategy. It's open by default is not something you do just because you think it's nice. It's because it gets you to your goals. And also the whole idea of contributing back. We had a challenge at the Sovereign Tech Agency where we designed questions around how we can make it more easy to contribute back. Is something that I think is a good strategy to bring more people on board as well. Because at the moment, the open source ecosystem is a bit extractive. Not enough people give back. Everyone profits. I think we also need to advocate for people to understand that better. Like, even if you're not thinking about open source, you're still like using it every day. Because it's the infrastructure layer that is running underneath what you're doing in your daily life. So really making that understanding of what is modern infrastructure, or what is infrastructure in the 21st century, and that it's open by default because it's all open source and you need it, so you should find ways of how to give back. That is one other side of the coin that I think we need to push a little bit more to the forefront in the current situation.
So next up, I'm going to come over to Jutta and get kind of the flip side of the of the coin when it comes to German open source collaboration. So Jutta, as we talked about, the government of Germany was a co-sponsor, and Zendes was a big part of that collaboration. In the 2025 conference, we'll be giving a lot of attention to kind of the mandate and activities of different OSPOs. I was just chatting to Omar before this, and we talked about OSPOs that are emerging all over the globe, including in small island states, multilateral development banks, industry, and we've kind of seen a surge of enthusiasm and people learning from the German model. So kind of in that context, Jutta, as Zendes is sort of a model OSPO, so to speak, in Europe, and you are its new CEO, what are some of the policy trends that you see happening globally, and how do you see governments kind of making a case for and kind of trying to encourage open source collaboration in the public sector?
Thank you. So I think there are a couple of things that we can see on a global scale, starting with the understanding that there is an IT stack that is running like all of the public sector activities, and that this stack by default needs to be an open source stack. We see this very successfully implemented like in Ukraine and in Estonia, but also in India. And now on the EU level, there came up the idea of having a Eurostack, which I think is a great idea because it goes one step away from these national stacks and making sure that we have a model that is able to be implemented like in any situation. And it is even more pushed forward by the GovStack initiative. And I think starting these thoughts and like moving away first from like only islands and small projects of implementing open source in public sector, and also moving away from like having islands in national setups, but moving towards a joint setup and a joint understanding of the technologies that the public sector needs, and that these bits and pieces need to be open source components. And having that understanding and building that stack is something that we definitely can do from a sender's perspective. It needs the efforts from like something like the Sovereign Tech Agency, because a lot of this stack is bits and pieces that nobody of the end users are going to see. It is a lot about infrastructure. So we need to make sure that these bits and pieces are receiving proper funding. And so what I think is important about the initiatives on the UN level is that it pulls all of that together. It is not only singular narratives anymore, but all of these are parts of the understanding that what Omar just shared, that the technologies are what is lying below all of the SDGs. None of them can be successful without having a proper technology layer. So we need to get into that big picture thinking here. And in that regard, I think it's also really great that the UN is pushing for that and adding to that the UN open source principles, because like the UN is a trusted brand, and that is so helpful also on the national level to make sure that the problems that we are facing are seen and well understood. Like I shared in my keynote, I don't see that currently happening in Germany, that the problems are really well understood. We have some lighthouses from the past legislation, like the setup of SENDES and the setup of the Sovereign Tech Agency, but we need to make sure that this funnels into a bigger picture, into a bigger strategy, and being able to tell the story like on a global scale with a lot of the support of the UN helps us also on a national level. So I think in the end it's a two-way beneficial situation, that the UN efforts can be supported by the national efforts, and on the other hand, on the national level, the UN efforts help us a long way.
Thank you so much, Jutta. So I wanted to do one last question kind of for our panel overall, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So open source collaboration does not take place in a vacuum. As we talked about earlier, open source is global. It doesn't exist in kind of national or regional silos. It's also shaped, as we learn here at FOSS Backstage, by both technical and non-technical contributions. So improving skills in education and the capacity to engage with open source ecosystems is vital. It's at the heart of what OSPOs are trying to do, in addition to develop open source alternatives or to contribute back. So what have you all learned about how we can do this? Like, how do we actually get kind of the human and technical capacity needed to build these OSPOs and make them operational? Omar, do you want to start? Yeah.
I can go first. I think what happened after the conference, especially the second one that was much bigger, is that we told the story of successes of OSPOs. So now we are a victim of, like, we get a lot of requests from cities, governments saying, I'm convinced, where should I start? Where can I start the OSPO? And I think this is something that we want to put some focus on, is we need to hold their hands. We need to build capacity of government and not only train them and give them whatever knowledge they need to be a Zendis or build an effective Zendis, but also provide them the tools. So some of the work we're doing right now is we're working, for instance, with the Asian Development Bank, who are now in process of building their OSPO. So we also want to give them tool sets. So we have this project that we call OSPO in a box. So here's a OSPO. Here's what you need. Here's the policies. Here are the networks. Here's the repositories. All what you need for that OSPO, not only to exist, but to be successful, to hit the ground running. Another thing that we are doing that for me is absolutely key is connecting the OSPO. Zendis, I can guarantee you, has the exact same problem than the OSPO of Mexico. And I'll tell you, the OSPO of Bangladesh had the same problem than the OSPO of Morocco. How can we start that discussion? How can we do the connection? So OSPO for Good in New York is one day a year. How can we multiply that? So we're working, hopefully want to build an online platform where we can have this discussion, not with the open source community, but with the actual OSPOs of government. Another thing we want to start doing is like regional OSPO for Good. Probably the East African countries, because they have similar needs, similar ecosystem, probably is more interesting if we bring them together. So this is kind of some of the elements we want to do to really have this multiplying effect. Another thing that we haven't talked about, and Adriana touched upon, is maintenance. There's all the neglected tools that are my boss used to work for the World Health Organization, and they have this big thing called the neglected diseases. So, but then where we're looking is that there are the neglected tools. Everybody wants to build new stuff. Nobody wants to maintain old stuff. Here again, as UN, how can we work with what Germany did is incredible with the Sovereign Tech Agency and the work you're doing. But there's multiple smaller scale elements, either from GitHub or from the industry or from other countries who are working on maintaining. How can we coordinate? Because there's no point of everybody doing it on their own. How can we actually make sense that all the neglected tools are taken care of, not just a small subset that is interesting for specific companies? So these are some of the area. And I just want to finish with thank you very much. I forgot about them. UN open source principles. Should not have forgotten about that. But this is a work that took us several months. We brought together all the UN agencies, and we came up with 8 principles called the UN open source principle. The first one is important, open by default. Second one is about contributing back. It's about documenting your tool. It's about scaling up. It's about inclusivity. It's about recognition. Give recognition to the people working for you. These were designed to be originally just for us. For anybody working with us, they have to endorse them. But that more and more, we realize a lot of actors in the ecosystem are actually very interested with that. And we open them for others, non-UN, to endorse them. And I'm very happy. We have Zendis here, who endorsed them. We have Sovereign Tech Fund, OFE. And then we have OSI, most importantly, the Open Source Initiative, are the first one to endorse them. So hopefully you're going to start seeing a lot of announcements in the coming weeks of all the entities. Open by default, they're actually also endorsed us. Hi. So please take a look. They're online. We'd love as many of you to endorse them and then adopt them and then actually translate them into day-to-day work. And hopefully by the time we get to the conference, we're hundreds. Now we are 25 to 30. We have the government of Kenya who endorsed them, by the way. That's an important partner. And hopefully we reach the 300, 400 marks by the time we meet all in June in New York.
I have to say, we have these calls every now and then with Omar, and every time he has like 5 new updates about all the things that the UN is doing. So thank you for sharing. Anybody else final thoughts on kind of the how of how we do this and kind of those technical, non-technical contributions that are needed?
Probably just briefly, I think what we need to leverage is the benefits of open source that provide for a resilient infrastructure, like that. It is not only that if there is like a global crisis that we are facing, and the open source technologies like stay robust during that external shocks. The beauty about open source is that it gets better with every challenge it faces, and this is something that we need to leverage, which is why we need to look at the open source principles, which make it so resilient, and that is a federated nature of technologies and a collaborative nature. So when we at Zendesk are building tools like open code, we necessarily look at building them the way that they can be used anywhere. So you can take the configuration as code, you can take the whole setup and like just implement it anywhere else in the world. And I think that is key. When on a national level we are driving things, we always need to make sure that they can be used anywhere else on the world.
Maybe I just echo that then quickly, thank you. And saying that a crisis is always an opportunity to also look at what we have, which is infrastructure that has been built from the bottom up by many, many talented people. It's decentral, it's global, it's like a global public digital good. We kind of have it like a gift and we take it for granted, but it's not working like that. So I think now it's maybe the opportunity to say, okay, we want to preserve this because this is what's allowing us to do so many good things. And that means we have to support the people contributing to this code, building new code. It's all open source. It's as I said, global. So we have to collaborate. We have to do it in a cooperative manner. And maybe the pressure we feel in many different fields right now simultaneously is really helping people, governments, companies to team up and be like, okay, this is great for all of us. So let's make sure it stays also healthy and available in the future. And we have certain instruments, we have communities, we have companies who know how important this is. So if we all team up, I think maybe that could be a positive outlook.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. So for an industry perspective, I think it's very important that you have an OSPO, because if you don't, then especially in a big company, you know, somebody's doing open source over there and somebody's doing open source over there. And they're not doing it in a concerted fashion and they're not talking to each other. So that means you're not making use of the full potential of open source. And you need an OSPO to have that in one unit in the company. And then also going further, you know, it helps you to talk to OSPOs from other companies, or even obviously government and outside of the company. So that's you know, establish basically a good and global network. And open source is, after all, about collaboration all over the world, right? So.
Thank you. That's a great place to end it on. We're going to take one, maybe two questions. Yeah.
But we have time for just two questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. But we also have to consider we have to operate the code somewhere. On a governmental scale, you need a governmental cloud, or on a UN scale, you need a United Nations cloud. And this has a critical mass, so you need a minimal number of servers. How do you address this? How to run it? OpenDesk is cloud native, OpenCode is cloud native, and all the other tools should also be cloud native. But how to run it without the hyperscalers?
We are running them on local sovereign clouds, and there are these options, and they just need more focus so that they can provide the same scale that the hyperscaler already have. But for our products, it is sufficient, and I think we definitely should, as public sector, make sure that we run our products on these sovereign clouds, and not go into the problem of sovereignty washing that is happening all over, where the label of sovereign is just tagged on a cloud that is not sovereign at all, because it is still governed by the Cloud Act, because, as I said before, updates can be just stopped, and then there's a general kill switch that will disable all activities happening that are connected to apps on that cloud. So yeah, on our side, we are well set up, and I think this is something that can be modeled in other countries as well.
Thank you. So just for context, I also work for the UN. I work for UNICEF. And in this morning's meeting, we heard about a roadmap on how to build in open source into the standard operating procedures of a states and its governments. And I love the UN principles, and yet I find quite hard to operationalize open source within my work, to procure technology that isn't logged into, you know, the UN, or at least UNICEF runs on Microsoft. Omar, I would love to hear what would your proposal be to streamline open source into the UN's own way of working and how we operate. If not, maybe that would be a great session for the conference coming up. Thanks.
Thank you. I think the fact that we already exist, it's already an achievement. So I sit within the UN information communication. This is the internal UN IT. If you had told me 5 years ago that the UN will have an office of open source, I'd tell you that it's never, ever going to happen. The fact that I am there is already something. The fact that we had the principles was a very big milestone for us, that now we put it in as a principles adopted. It was adopted by a big UN committee that open source is by default. I think the change is incremental. I think, again, if I put myself in the shoes of the CIO of the UN, it cannot be overnight. You still are now relying on commercial tool. We are fully locked into some of these commercial tools, but the discussion has started. So there's this big meeting happening in May where the whole discussion would be about the vendor lock-in internally at the UN with other agencies. It's incremental. It's going to take many, many, many years to decouple, but I think now everybody is aware that open source is the main way. There's no other way going out. I don't know, I can name the company, but the company came up and last year and then multiplied their license cost by 6. And now that completely destroyed the budget that we had, and this company we can do without. So now, how long are we want to be able, like, be in a slave of this and running behind these companies? So this is it's a discussion that is going to take several years, but I can guarantee you the process has started and is not going to go back. The genie is out of the bottle, and as we said, like the toothpaste is out, you can put it back.
Well, what we can see is that it's software and open source, and it plays a fundamental role in the modern society, right? But the general population, from my perspective, they don't understand the role that software plays there, especially open source. So my question for you is, like, how critical it is to educate the population, the general population, about the role of software in society, especially open source. How do we get there? And have you seen good examples of this already?
I think that we underestimate the power of open source. I think there's a lot of discussion about data, AI, but I love somebody told me that if data is the new gold, software are the refineries, and you cannot use the oil without refineries. So it's absolutely fundamental, the power of software and the importance we have to give to software. Now, how to do the education? I think first we have to start education a lot of our government. So the problem is most public administration or government do not see the power or the importance of that. And this is why OSPO for Good, our conference, or others are really key. Then we try to bring in as many government or decision maker as possible so they get to actually hear from, it's one thing if they hear it from me, but it's different if they hear it from you guys. So that is one. The other one is to each one of us has to find a way to reach out to their decision maker. So be it industry, be it public administration, we should all of us do this outreach effort and then push the message to them. But yeah, it's understated.
Yeah, again, happy to be the echo here. Yes, because we also took the angle of talking to governments about this, because it is de facto infrastructure. So we're like, okay, this is a public service actually in the 21st century. We haven't fully understood that yet as political systems, that if we want to do our job properly, and we kind of agreed, not everywhere, not always, that we have to invest public money in the public interest in some things, and we not leave it all out either just to the market or just to volunteers. So I think finding this niche, or not niche actually, finding this new important job for the governments to be like, okay, we need to put money in this ecosystem, strengthening the open source ecosystem, in this horizontal layer, because it's the underlying foundation for most everything what we want to achieve, be it education or health or government transformation or security, is a very important step. And I'm always a bit wary of putting the individual like too much in the front. It's like the same with climate change. You know, it's important to educate, but it's lazy to outsource it to everyone individually doing better life choices. Like, we need the big players to take up the most of the responsibility, change what they are doing, and not be like, hey, okay, well, you can just do this and that, and then we solve the problem. Hey, you can just only use open source, and that's going to change the problem. I think that's why I see governments and businesses in such an important role here to understand it and act accordingly.
Well, thank you so much for our panelists.